is typical of the Midwest with 4 distinct seasons and mostly cold, snowy winters and hot, humid summers. The largest employers in the area are Rush Copley Medical Centers and Caterpillar Incorporated. Paul's history is filled with abuse, committed by his very own hands. He grew up in Aurora without a father figure in his life and a strained relationship with his mother. No stranger to jails or prisons, Paul spent time in both. He lived in Mississippi for a time with his grandmother and various other relatives, yet that didn't stop his troublemaking ways. On March 8, 1994, Paul attacked his then-girlfriend Shirese Jones, beating her with a baseball bat and stabbing her with a knife. The incident transpired outside their apartment in Mississippi. When police found Shirese, she was bleeding profusely from stab wounds, including 2 on her neck. During this attack, Paul smacked Shirese's head against the apartment complex's brick exterior wall. She tried mightily to fight back, screaming for help, crying out her life to be saved, fearing that as Paul kicked her in the stomach, that was going to kill her. Shirese told police that Paul was overly controlling and faked remorse so he could get attention. Paul was charged and was convicted for this offense in 1995, but served less than 3 years in prison. Once he was released, Paul moved to Illinois and began working at the Henry Pratt Company, where he worked for 15 years leading up to the shooting.
He'd speak under his breath and just mumble things, and, it didn't seem like he was all there half the time.
One of Paul's favorite pastimes was enjoying cigars, and just about every day he would go to the local Circle K, which was only a few blocks from his apartment, and purchase 2 or 3 Black & Milds. Employees at the convenience store reported that Paul was always cheerful and friendly with them. The apartment where he lived was a large complex called the Aurora Acorn Woods Apartments in Aurora, and it was about 5 miles northeast of his workplace. Though Paul had his violent tendencies in relationships, neighbors saw him as a man who was often out and about, but never really would say anything. Paul would usually be found outside of the complex playing with his drones and remote-controlled cars. Cars of all kinds interested Paul, and when not playing with his RC cars or drones, he could be found working on his car, which was a souped-up Nissan. One neighbor reported that he would talk to Paul on an almost regular basis, yet Paul never mentioned anything about guns, owning any firearms, and he certainly never discussed any problems at work.
He rarely talked. He was really quiet, lived by himself.
He would sit outside at night. He would stare at people.
Paul was a violent man and had 6 prior arrests with the Aurora Police Department, which followed his previous prison stint. The arrests in Illinois ranged from minor traffic offenses to more serious domestic violence offenses, and even for violating a PPO, or Personal Protection Order, in 2008. In 2017, Paul was arrested for disorderly conduct and criminal damage to property by the Oswego Police Department. Paul's troubles weren't limited to criminal court either. In 2000, the Aurora Police Department issued him a citation for illegally altering the speakers in his car and squealing his tires, and in 2002, he was sued by his landlord. The judge entered an order of possession against him. Paul's mom later indicated that he was stressed out around the time of the shooting, yet she could provide no substantial reason for why. It appears that Paul had recently started a new relationship approximately 2 weeks before he committed his killing spree, and while that may have been a part of his stress, it's simply not clear. One thing that is known about Paul is that he had a problem with authority. He didn't like to be told what to do, which often caused him to have an attitude with his supervisors. He repeatedly broke the rules regarding cell phones on the plant floor, always having his phone out. It appears that Paul was somewhat paranoid on top of his anger issues, as was evidenced by the camera he installed overlooking his parking spot, because he always worried about his car being vandalized.
You would never think that your neighbor would be the one to do a mass shooting, We talked a couple of times.
The saddest part of today's story is just how preventable it was. There is neither a valid or reasonable excuse to commit any act of violence, let alone a mass shooting event. Yet, most of the shooters we have covered experienced some form of mental illness to varying degrees. However, there is no history of mental illness, horrific conditions growing up, or any other reason for this to have happened. Paul was just violent and angry. He knew he was about to lose his job, so he acted out in the worst, most inhumane way possible. What makes this event even more unbearable is that Paul was issued a gun license by the Illinois State Police, even though he had a prior felony conviction. In fact, even when his firearm license was revoked, there was absolutely no follow-up done to ensure that he turned the firearms over to police. On March 11, 2014, Paul bought a Smith & Wesson handgun, and the same year as when he applied for a firearm owner's identification card. When he did so, the 1995 aggravated assault conviction from Mississippi didn't appear in the initial background check. 5 days later, on March 16, 2014, Paul applied for a CPL, or a concealed pistol license, which is when the conviction was discovered on his record. The conviction wasn't found until the second background check, because the second used a digital fingerprinting system versus an older, antiquated one. Later, a review was ordered to investigate why Paul's gun wasn't confiscated after the conviction was discovered, and his FOID, or firearm owner's identification, was revoked. The previous prison conviction from Mississippi should have barred Paul from even purchasing a gun. The Illinois State Police mailed Paul a letter, letting him know his gun permit was revoked, and he must turn his handgun into the police or transfer ownership to a legal gun owner. The letter was mailed on April 15, 2014, and the state provided him 48 hours to turn in or transfer possession of the firearm. Paul never did so. No follow-up was ever done. And the very gun that was meant to be confiscated was the same that was used to brutally murder innocent lives. Survivor Tim Williams filed a $2 million lawsuit against the Illinois State Police on this specific issue. A year after the shooting, a Henry Pratt memorial exhibit opened at the Aurora Art and History Center in downtown Aurora. The exhibit contains 5 crosses, one for each victim, which were donated to the Aurora Historical Society, who in turn made them a part of the display, along with the memorabilia that was left behind at the gates of the factory. First responders from all over the United States mailed various items and gifts to the Aurora Police Department. They were meant as gestures of solidarity and sympathy, and were also added to the memorial exhibit. The local community banded together, raising almost $1.1 million for the victims' survivors and families. Tens of thousands of dollars were donated to the Aurora Fire Department, who, in turn, donated the money to the Aurora Strong Community Fund. The sheer magnitude of care that this community had for each other, the way they showed up for each other, is to be commended. This is what community is and should be. People looking out for their neighbor and showing basic compassion for mankind. Sadly, less than half of the gun owners in the state of Illinois that have had their licenses revoked adhere to the instructions which require the citizen to prove there are no longer firearms in their possession. In 2013, a gun suppression team was launched by the Cook County Sheriff. The intent was to track down gun owners who have had their licenses recalled. 11,000 revocation letters were sent in Illinois in 2018 alone. Over half of the firearms owners that received them failed to follow through. On Paul's firearms license application, when it asked if he had been convicted of a crime, Paul wrote, "No." Furthermore, it doesn't appear a notice of the revocation letter was ever sent to the Aurora Police Department. At least, Aurora Police do not have any record of ever receiving a letter. The Illinois state law does not require warrants to be issued when a revoked person fails to forfeit their guns. However, the hard reality is that few police agencies have the resources or manpower to spend time tracking down illegal gun owners. The law in Illinois requires that all gun owners must possess a firearms license. Today's case is a stark reminder that mass shooting events don't follow any type of blueprint or stereotype. They aren't limited to schools, concerts, and malls. Mass shootings, or mass murder events, can be committed by a man, woman, mentally ill, stable, unstable, rational, or somewhere in between. One thing is for sure, There is no description of a mass murderer. It could be your neighbor, relative, or coworker. This is why we stress. When you see something, say something. When someone you know or love seems to be struggling or going through something, reach out. You never know how many lives you may be saving. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Active Shooter, the podcast. Remember, if you see something, say something. There's no telling how many lives you may be saving.
A huge thank you to Darren Curtis, who composed some of the music used in this episode. Check him out at darrencurtismusic.com. DARRENCURTIS music.com.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter
with mass casualty incidents.
Make sure to check us out on social media. We have a discussion group on Facebook. Just search for Active Shooter, the podcast discussion group. You can also find us on Instagram at Active the Podcast and Twitter at Podcast Active. For just $1 a month, you can get access to ad-free episodes, early release episodes when available, and a shout-out on the show. Just go to patreon.com/Active the Podcast. Thank you, and be safe.
Hey guys, I'm Abby.
And I'm Shauna, and we're the host of a podcast called Anxious and Afraid.
Do you love deep dives into true crime,
the paranormal,
strange history,
conspiracies? Well, so do we, and each week we take turns surprising each other with whatever anxiety-inducing subject we are obsessed with that week.
Tune in each week to hear Shauna mispronounce words.
The guys on the lookout apparently asked for binoculars. Did I say that right?
So the photos showed him and his colleague entertaining... Wait, am I saying it wrong? Yes. And listen in as Abby constantly asks too many questions.
I was about to ask you a lot of questions, and I'm glad that you interrupted me. Continue.
I would have told you to shut up.
I don't know what
Stop
I'm trying
quizzing
to
me.
do.
Okay, you know, I did enough research. Let me just tell the damn story.
Jesus. Continue. Episodes drop every Tuesday, available wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also find us at our website, anxiousandafraid.com.
We're always looking for new friends, so don't forget to rate and subscribe.